I'd like to call to order the work session for September 17th. All present except for Mayor Lord and Councilmember Stipp, and I'm sure he'll be running in the door any second. We have 2 items tonight on our agenda, and I would like to remind council to refrain from asking questions until the staff presentations are complete. I've asked staff if they wanted to split their presentation, and they do not. They're going to give the complete presentation, and so as it's being given, council, please write your questions down, and then when it's time for the discussion, I'll make sure that every one of us have an opportunity to ask whatever questions we might have. And the first item is to receive an update on the draft land use assumptions and infrastructure improvement plan. Finance Manager Laurie Wiggenroth will present. Good evening, Laurie. Again.
Thank you. Thank you. And I have with me, if you don't remember from our prior our meeting in February and other meetings, is Tony Hairston, our consultant, who's been doing all the really hard number crunching and researching behind what we've been doing here.
Good afternoon.
So I will go through a presentation. It should be fairly short, and then we'll, as the Vice Mayor said, we'll answer your questions, hear your feedback, and we'll have staff and Tony help with questions that I can't handle. So to begin with, we won't go into all the background we've been going into about what this involves. We're here to get you've gone through a public hearing and some other presentations and work sessions about the impact fee program that we're updating. Again, we're just going through a number of statutory requirements. I want to remind you that this is for the infrastructure only. You'll hear words like level of service, but it's really talking about infrastructure. Impact fees don't pay for the operating costs. Those would be paid by the general fund or the water or wastewater fund. And we've also, with the public hearing that we held in August, we started the 60-day clock that we have to adopt this IIP and LUA. And then as another reminder, these plans are really the essence of what you're approving, though there's a whole nother process to adopt the fees. These plans are what the fees need to be based on, or the city would be obligated to make up any difference if we don't ultimately adopt the fees that would be calculated out of the plan. And so with that, we'll move on. Just again as a reminder, this is a map of the entire city. You may hear me say citywide sometimes when I'm talking about impact fees. I try to use the word program-wide. The blue area is the only area where we currently have impact fees, and it's the only areas that we're looking at in this particular update. And then just to give you again a reminder, currently we have the north fees in the blue area, the central fees in this pink area, and then the green and yellow is what we call south. Through this plan, we're recommending combining the blue and the pink into an area just called north, and then we'd have the area that's the south. And again, the yellow area in the south is the only place that water and wastewater fees are currently supporting, and that's the same moving forward as well. So what I thought we'd do is quickly run through what infrastructure is now included in the plan, because this really is a plan about what is the infrastructure that growth demands. And we've talked before, it's a series of formulas of looking at the current service level and applying that to population and job forecasts. And so what's included in the police area, and the police is the one fee that is program-wide. All the other fees are broken into the north and south. And so for police, we're including almost just shy of 19,000 square foot of building. That includes phase 2 of the police expansion and then future police space that might be needed. The costs are based on the forecast for the cost of phase 2 expansion of the operations facility. The plan also calls for 33 vehicles and the addition of 1 radio tower. and that's a new addition. There's not a radio tower in the current plan. And these costs are based on the FY19 CIP in terms of the police operations facilities cost. Now we'll go through the areas where there's both a north and a south fee. I've got fire and parks combined on this slide just to kind of cut back what we have here. In the north, for fire, there's 22,000 square foot of building demanded by the forecasted growth and 4 vehicles. 2,200 square feet is the equivalent of one plus almost a second facility or a fire station. In parks, the demand is for 32.6 acres of park. We have costs included for that, and I'd remind you that the 30-acre park currently under design is the bulk of what that program is. And then in the south, the demand is basically for one additional fire station, which is also the fire station that's currently under design, and then 2 vehicles. Parks, the demand is for 20.5 acres of park. However, this is an expansion of the Foothills Community Park, and we only have 17 acres, so there's a geographic or a physical limit to the 17 acres. So that's the only costs that have been included. We did not include an additional 3.5 acres in cost, given there's not a place to locate a park like that right now. I want to highlight that the parks costs that are included here are based on the FY18 CIP, because again, that project has not been fully vetted as we went through changing our CIP process. So those costs are based on that, those costs from the FY18, and the fire costs are based on the current CIP. In the areas we just talked about, police, fire, and parks, there's been no changes since what we presented to you for the August 27th public hearing. For streets, there are changes from what we presented on August 27th. One of the things we noted in that presentation was that there was a traffic study being funded by Newland that was being performed. That traffic study is now complete, and we have recommended that we extend the Estrella Bridge project to take 15 years to consume. So what that means is 2/3 of the costs are now included in this plan, and that other third of costs will be included the next time we update the plan for the next 5 years. So we identified that as an expected outcome, and that is what came from the study. In addition, that study suggested that the Estrella and Cotton intersection that was included really is probably falling just outside the 10 years. So we've also removed that project from what you saw on August 27th. And in the north, we had received a request from a stakeholder to consider removing one of the street, or 2 of the street projects. We ultimately removed 1, but not the second one. We believe the second one is required. So those changes, you'll see the fee impact from those changes a little later, but that's changes that we've made, and you can see them here. This slide lists the streets that are now included in the plan. And I want to remind you, streets is an area where there's been a lot of change for 2 reasons primarily. When we started this process, that we were concerned about the issue of scallop streets and the potential, and looking for ways to perhaps avoid that. And so we had included the streets, all streets that we believed, and these are arterial streets, we had included all streets that we believed would be needed in the next 10 years, including, and we included in the plan the cost of streets that may have been a future obligation of development, but we didn't anticipate that development would occur. And as we went through the stakeholder process, it became clear that it was probably not appropriate to prepay for an obligation of a future developer. So the new plan includes only streets that are projected to be needed in the next 10 years, that are not adjacent to developable land or land that would be where there would be a development obligation. So if it's next to state land, so for example, if there was work to be done near the prison, that would be the type of street that would be included. And so on this slide, you can see we did remove the McDowell Road, Loop 303 to Citrus. That was one of the two streets that a stakeholder asked about. And in that discussion, it's very near the end of the 10 years. So we've gone ahead and removed that street. It's most likely going to, you'll see it when we do another update in 5 years, because as I say, it was just right on the crux of the need. And then in south, as I mentioned previously, we've removed the intersection. So the only project in the South Streets area is the bridge at 2/3 of its cost. And this is just a map to remind you of where water and wastewater apply. In general, the green area is the portion in the south where they apply. The blue is where water applies and wastewater, and then the little brown area is where only wastewater applies. As we go through this, and when we talk about the north fee applies everywhere in the north, but if you're not in our water or wastewater service area, you would not be subject to the water or wastewater portion of the fee. So in water, both areas include their proportionate demand-based portion of the surface water project. So we went through that surface water project. Not all the costs of the surface water project are in here. Some of that project's being funded from other sources. Plus, its capacity will last beyond the 10 years. So it's only the portions that are attributable to growth in this time frame. There are financing costs associated with that project included as well. In the north, there's also the GRIC lease, which is a continuation that's been in the plan all along. It's a continuation of that debt service. And then there's some other transmission and storage projects. In the south, there is the Northern Solutions Transmission and Wells. Those are an existing developer obligation. That work has been completed and is now eligible for reimbursement. And the Rainbow Valley Booster reimbursement. We've updated any developer reimbursement has been updated to what was owed at the end of this most recently completed fiscal year. So some dollar amounts have come down because we have completed additional reimbursement. And then there's also a 1.5 MGD reservoir included in the south. Wastewater includes expansions to the Goodyear Water Reclamation Facility. I will note that we have removed, previously we had the full cost of adding anaerobic digestion to the plant in the plan cost. Only the portion of those costs attributable to the growth in the coming 10 years is now included. So that adjusted that fee downward. And then the WIFA debt service is another item that's continuing from prior years. And there's also a major sewer line in the north. And for Rainbow Valley, there's completing the reimbursement and expansions included for that plant. So that's the infrastructure that's included. And now we can kind of go through what that means in terms of fees. So this shows you for the northern area, the fee costs, comparing the current fee to the new fee. And one of the things I wanted to remind you is we'll kind of talk a little bit about why some of these costs are changing. I want to remind you that one of the basic reasons that we needed to move forward with our plan update is that the current plan did not assume any inflation. So the costs in the plan are from 2013. So almost about a 20% cost increase or higher could be expected simply from the impact of inflation if we hadn't changed the infrastructure that was included. But to kind of go through this, the police fee has a higher percentage increase than some of the others. That's primarily attributable to the inclusion of the radio tower, and then in addition, higher costs for the facility. In fire, in the north area, the prior plan only included one station. We are including the cost of all the demanded station square footage, so that is equivalent to having almost a full another station in this plan compared to the current plan. In streets, and I have a little asterisk there just to say I use the average of the north and south fee for streets. That's the area where we're combining areas for comparison purposes. Streets is higher. The streets in the current plan, I would describe as being more of a piecemeal approach. What we're presenting here is a practice that we can move forward with where we clearly know what's in the plan. It's arterial streets of 4 or 6 lanes that are not adjacent to land where there would be developer obligations, and we've included the full cost of those street improvements. Parks is just the cost of moving forward with these parks. Water is reflecting the kind of the change in the infrastructure. And then wastewater, the decrease in wastewater is primarily in the West Goodyear area. There were a number of lines that were previously included in the plan or included today. And through the development agreements that we have there, those are the obligation of those developers. So those lines are the primary reason for this fee coming down. In the south, the fees go up a little bit higher percentage than they did in the north. The primary reason for that is the inclusion of that bridge. It's a very expensive piece of infrastructure. Police is up for the same reason as the other. And then parks, in the current plan, the only thing that's included is the cost of the land for the park, because we were reimbursing Newland for the entire land down there for that park, that entire Foothills Park area. The plan now also includes the improvements to build a park on that land. So that's the primary reason why the water is going up. The parks is going up. And then wastewater, we'd already done that adjustment there earlier in the year. We did that mini update to bring in the surface water plant and take out some of the well solutions. So we pretty much had already updated the water piece, and that's why there's not much change in water. And then in wastewater, it's just the cost of additional plant expansion. And this goes through the examples we selected to show for your non-residential, the impact of these fees on non-residential. As you can see, the percentages are slightly different than you see in the residential area, just by the nature of how the fees are applied in the non-residential areas. I would point out that, we're showing you a 20,000 square foot retail and a 400,000 industrial. Just to give you a sense, these are very large numbers. These are also very large projects that people come through with. In the examples that we have here in North, the retail at 20,000 square feet, that's a little more than $7,900 per 1,000 square foot is what that impact fee is. That's the high of those. In industrial, that fee is about $1,260 per square foot or for 1,000 square feet. So the fees look large, and the industrial one looks unusually large, but it's also a very large project compared to the others. And as you know, we've gone through the stakeholder process to get to this point, and what I can say is the stakeholders have been generally supportive, and we have a lot of support for what we've recommended here. There are a few items that came up through the stakeholder process that we have not fully addressed, and I'll go through those next. Police and fire, there was a request to consider using call data, and I mentioned this at the presentation on the public hearing. We just, there would be more data analysis, and in essence, it shifted, depending on what approach you use, it either shifts more to residential or more to non-residential. And we had general concurrence at it. We had a stakeholder meeting after the public hearing, And we had general concurrence from the group at that meeting that staying with the current approach would kind of got you in between those two extremes. We did have one stakeholder from the non-residential area who was not, came up after the meeting to express some concerns about the fee in the industrial area. In water and wastewater, there was a request to consider using charging residential, whether residential has a 3/4 inch meter or a 1 inch meter, the same impact fee. So our current practice is that the 3/4 meter pays a fee, and that's a little bit lower than that, well, about $5,000 lower than the fee that a 1 inch meter would pay. We've done some research and analysis, and our 1 inch residential customers use on average 45% more water than the 3/4 inch meter users. That means more infrastructure is needed to support that higher water use. And we have about 13% of our current residential meters are 1 inch. The stakeholder who's raised this concern has said, hey, your underlying plan is kind of built on this 402 gallons per day for all your users. And that is correct, and it is consistent throughout the plan. The entire plan is built on what is a 3/4 inch meter, and all the fees are built up from there. So there is, if we were to, so staff is not recommending this change. If we did need to move forward with this type of change, we would need to relook the whole program in the water and wastewater area. And just as an example, and it's not as simple as the math I'm going to talk about, but if it was as simple as just saying, well, let's figure out what the weighted average is for the 3/4 meter residential and the 1 inch residential, that would mean increasing the 3/4 inch meter fee. The result would be that the people getting 3/4 inch meters now would pay about $500 or $600 more, or $500 to $700 more for the fee, and the 1 inch meters would drop about $4,000. So that's kind of what the impact would be. And again, the group, we don't vote in the stakeholder meeting. We just talk and ask for what folks think. In general, the consensus at the stakeholder meeting was to stick with the current plan. We also, in this slide, we're saying, I'd mentioned that there was a review of where we are, given we developed these infrastructure needs a little over a year ago. And we talked about the potential of adding odor control at the Rainbow Valley Water Reclamation Facility. On this slide, I'm saying that we're not recommending adding the odor control. We have continued conversations with Newland, who has raised this as a need. We believe it would be appropriate to continue those conversations and add the portion of the cost of the odor control that's associated with growth, kind of similar to that anaerobic digester, add odor control to the whole plant, but then only the growth share would go into the fee. And that would probably change the fee by about $150 to $200 would be an increase. We also had, at the public hearing, you did have one individual come forward and ask if there's a way to phase in the fees. Again, we're not recommending that as staff. There is already a statutory moratorium for people that have already gotten their plats and pulled a building permit to be protected for up to 2 years from when they pulled that building permit. And fee decreases go in immediately, so the wastewater fee decrease everybody would benefit from immediately. And by the time these fees are in place, it will be well over a year that we've been talking about this process and publicly discussing the potential financial impacts. And then finally, if we did present some kind of phase-in approach, we'd create many moratoriums, because every time the fee went up, we'd create a new 24-month moratorium. Then if the fee went up again, it'd be another 24-month moratorium. So administratively, it'd be very difficult to monitor that. And again, if the council opted to do that, we would have to make up the difference from other city resources for that phase-in period. And then the last item that we had identified that we would come to you was a policy discussion. And again, staff is recommending that we do not exclude any of the streets costs, but I wanted to make sure we reviewed this with you. We've included all the cost components of streets, such as utility relocation, sidewalks, street lighting, median landscaping. When we initially started this process, you'll recall the streets fees were fairly high, and we were looking for lots of different ways that we could find a method to address those costs. We've included in the report information on what those individual components cost, and can certainly answer any questions about how taking one of those out might impact the fee. In the end, what we don't include would have to be built by the city, because again, if you'll recall, these are streets where there is not a developer anticipated. So if we want sidewalks and we want street lighting, we want medians, it would either be to include that on those streets here or for the city to find it in other places. And we had general concurrence from the stakeholder group with the recommendation to include all of the streets cost. I think it's probably one of the areas where we had one of the most positive statements about moving forward by including these costs. And so with that, we'll answer your questions, anxious to hear your feedback. We do have the opportunity to have another work session if needed before October 22nd. It is essential that we act on this plan by October 22nd, or it will start the process over on the IIP and the LUA piece.
All right.
And I just wanted to add at the end that
certainly
at the end of this process, certainly you have to meet the statutory requirements that Lori went over. But your ideal outcome is to get the infrastructure and the policy that meets the demands of your current and future citizens, but also works with the development community as well. And there was a tremendous amount of input from the development community that went into this and fine-tuning it. There's always going to be nuances and whatnot, but I think that this process has been really good and helpful to try to strike that balance. And I think y'all are getting much closer to that because of that process. So the ideal outcome is that balance at the end.
Thank you. All right, Council. We will one at a time do any questions we might have. Councilmember Stipp, we just want to let you know this is the process. It's like we normally do, but we're going to hopefully answer some of the questions that we already might have by us asking our own questions. And I'm going to start with Councilmember Pizzillo first.
Okay. Just a clarification on the 2-year moratorium. If we were to adopt the fees today, does that mean we can't collect any of the new fees for 24 months? Is that what that means?
The moratorium, and this is, we're still working on actually a document to give the stakeholders at this week's meeting. We have a meeting with them later this week. On a residential property, if there's a plat and they pull a permit before the new fees go into effect, they're protected for 2 years from when they pulled that first building permit. So if the fees went into effect today and they had pulled their first building permit the day before yesterday, they'd have 2 years under the old fees. If they pull that building permit after the fees go into effect, then the new fees apply.
So staff, I would assume, is going to have to, if we adopted the fees today, is going to have to go back 24 months and flag every one of those building permits that have been pulled within that 2-year period.
Yes, sir. That's what the process we'll have to go through. That's a process that
Okay.
Development Services staff went through that when we adopted these fees in August of 14.
I just want to get that clear in my head. I wasn't quite sure if it started when, so that makes sense. The other question I have is, Um, can we get something that shows what our projected fees will be and compare them to what the area surrounding us is charging? And it doesn't have to be exact. What I mean is what you did right there with the, what is it, the 20,000 retail. My concern, we're starting to grow and take off over here on the west side. And what I don't want to do, from my perspective, is create an undue disadvantage for us when we start attracting the retail and the amusement and those type of things here, as well as getting the rooftops that's going to drive those type of things. So I just want to make sure we're not at a disadvantage. So that would be very helpful to me as we go forward. And I understand if we come in at a lesser amount, we have to make up that difference. And I know that. I might even be willing to set a fund if that's the case, if we're over. But you know, I would love to know where we are there because I don't want to stymie our growth as it starts coming our way.
Right. I don't know if Elmo's available. If I have we didn't include that chart that we've been presenting
Right.
because we were hoping to get some more information today. So the first two columns are our current central and south fees. The next two columns are the north and south fee under what I just reviewed with you. And then the balance of the columns are the other cities. None of them have been updated yet. They are all even. Avondale was originally going to be having a session today, but that has been postponed. We understand their fees are probably going to be right about where they are now. So you can see that our fees that you're looking at today are fairly close to those other city fees if you ignore Surprise. They don't have a streets fee in Surprise. And you can also see, and that reminds you too that it's, you know, comparing, these are apples and oranges in some case, you know, different cities use different ways to finance their infrastructure. You'll see Peoria, the blue bar is very small. That's the water bar. It's my understanding they don't put their infrastructure in their impact fees. They probably gain that out of their rates. And again, I don't have all the facts, and you'll notice then they have a very high streets fee. So each jurisdiction approaches this slightly different in terms of what costs they bear through impact fees and what costs they bear through property taxes or other general revenues.
How does the commercial, the retail, amusements?
We will, that is a little bit more difficult to calculate. We'll see if we can, those same examples that we use for ours, we'll task somebody with going through and doing a comparison on those same three examples.
Okay, thank you. That would be very helpful. Because again, I don't want to scare away any future growth we got coming our way. So,
and council member, I will remind all of you again that you also have the ability, similar to what you've done with the retail incentive program where you have right now, where you've set aside a dollar amount that could be available to help offset impact fees. You certainly have the ability to do that as another way to approach dealing with areas where there's specific concerns.
and I realize that, and that's kind of in the back of my head, depending on where these fees are. So thank you.
I have a question about this particular slide.
Okay.
So, Lori, Zone 1 in Peoria and Buckeye Central East makes me believe that there are multiple zones in those cities. Do you have that information for the others? And what is Peoria Zone 1? Is that where the growth is, or is that fill in what?
Tony, do you recall?
Yeah, on those comparisons, it's where we understood most of the growth was happening in a comparable area of the city to what Goodyear's facing. We did have the other fees at one point, and I believe in maybe both in Buckeye and Peoria, that a lot of the fees were just different by a small amount. But I can't recall off the top of my head if one had, some of the zones were drastically different. But in a lot of them, we just picked a representative of those areas.
Yeah, I think it would be either important to talk either about the growth in those particular areas or see all of them. I would hate to see, let's say that there's 4 zones in Peoria and Zone 4 is what Surprise is. I mean, I think we should know where those are and and kind of look through that, because this chart obviously looks much better than the chart that we showed in August. So I just wanted a little clarity on that. Thanks.
Councilmember, we'll work on coming up with some way to present that information.
Are there any other questions just on this slide? All right, then we'll move on, and Councilwoman Larantano with her questions.
Yes, I had a couple questions. First of all, I agree with Councilmember Pizzillo. That's exactly what I was thinking. I'd like to see them kind of spread out exactly, make sure we're in the ballpark, because we don't want to be, extremely high. We want to be reasonable. And we can only update these every 10 years, right? Every 5 years.
Councilmember, we can update them as often as practical. We are required by the statute to do it every 5 years. Okay. But we could, if we were really wanting to go through this a lot, we could go through an update process as often as the council would like. And you may also recall we did a mini update specifically on the water in the south earlier in the year. We do have the ability, if we're not going to change the fee by more than 5%, if, for example, we had a street that we had put on here that we thought would happen 12 years from now, that one street we took out, if we suddenly find 2 years from now we really need to pull that back in, it's possible we could just add that if we would stay under the 5% increase and go through an abbreviated process, or we could swap out infrastructure. So there are abilities to make some changes without the full-blown process.
Oh, and now I got my computer up. When we were talking about some of the streets fees, what was going to be done because Estrella and Cotton is a complete intersection. I'm glad that's off there. I don't think it needs work, but what was going to be done there?
I'll let Rebecca help answer that question.
She might as well stay up here because all my questions are street questions. So. And I'm trying to think what would have been done up there.
Hi, Vice Mayor and Council Member Larantano. Thank you for the question. And actually, the roundabout that is there today will no longer function once there's a certain amount of traffic, which we anticipate.
It doesn't function well now for some people.
And so it'll be converted into a straight intersection with a traffic signal.
Okay. That's good to know, because I was like, it's done, so what are we doing? So that's obviously far in the future. That's why it's taken off.
That is correct. It's toward the end of the 10 years, or right about the 10, 11 years. So again, we'll look at it again in 4 or 5 years when we update the IIP again to see if it's closer, and then it may be brought back into the plan.
And then some of the intersections with Estrella, when it's bumping up against either MC85 or Vineyard, that's some county property there. Is there any way that we'll get any contribution from the county on any of that, perhaps?
And so let me jump in here where we keep referring to the bridge. That actually is the section from MC85. We're going to be improving down to Vineyard, so it includes the bridge, but it is that full section, and it would be just south of MC85 actually. But north of MC85, we already have the improvements on Estrella.
And then my last question for streets, so my last one for you is when the reliever, the I-10 reliever comes through there, I don't know if that's even, I mean, it's kind of slated, but it's not funded, my understanding is yet. So would that help us anyway with some of those improvements? Because obviously that's going to cross our road. Is that anything that will help assist us at all? Or we don't know yet?
I'll hesitate to answer that question right now without looking into it.
Okay, because I just wonder if it's something that would be my question. If we get, if there's any funding there to assist us with our road, because obviously it'll get tore up at some point when they build the freeway through there.
Well, and again, if you recall, when the 303 and that interchange was done, we were provided funds from ADOT for making improvements to McDowell and a couple of the other roads that were utilized. So I would presume we would have those same types of conversation. If there was any anticipated negative impact to our roadways, ADOT would participate in assisting us with those.
Okay, that's all I got. Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Stipp.
I do not have any streets questions, if you can believe that. My only focus, I think, on where we're at now is the result to the what Councilmember Pizzillo was talking about was the non-residential fees. I think we're looking at very substantial increases And we are also looking at some substantial investment in our community before us. And I know, I think we all believed that there was some negative impact to the initial fees that came out. That was absolutely verified to me in several conversations that I had last week, that the large fees had a negative impact on what was happening in our community as far as development goes. I'm very concerned that a 100% increase in industrial over 400,000 square foot, what kind of negative impact that is going to have, and whether those fees are really commensurate with the actual impact that they're going to have. A 400,000 square foot warehouse does not generate traffic, police calls, fire calls. They don't use a lot of water. I mean, and for 100% impact, and maybe this is a sidebar conversation that somebody needs to have with me, but I'm just not seeing that that's a $500,000 impact. Now, granted that there are some, so I'm very concerned about that, just in general. So, if you're looking for feedback, that's my feedback on that. And I find it particularly peculiar, I guess, that the cost of doing that same structure in the south is really not much more than in the north, and it's a much farther travel area. So I would think that the cost, the quote unquote impact, would actually be greater than $87,000. So that's kind of where I'm at with that. The residential fees, they appear more reasonable than they had been. And I don't believe we have another public hearing. Do we have one more public hearing?
No, Councilmember, there's no more public hearings scheduled at this point in time.
So to the stakeholders that are in the audience, John, can you raise your hand? Raise your hand, John. That's John Rader. That's the council assistant. I would love to hear what your feedback is. So if you'd like to get in touch with John, I'd love to hear what you have to think about these new fees. Because I think that those stakeholders there are business residents. And I think we need to hear, I would like to hear from you. And since we don't have a public hearing and it's not appropriate at this setting, I'd love to hear from you offline what you guys think where we're at. I did hear great comments about how the development community folks that I spoke to were very appreciative of the work that staff has done, and that the willingness to work through they were astounded, quite honestly, that we were willing to take the steps that we did. So I'm really appreciative of that. And I think to make myself be able to sleep at night, I'd like to hear from the folks that cared enough to come here tonight to hear what they have to say.
Councilmember Stipp, I appreciate your comments. I will share with you a couple of things. We do have a stakeholder meeting on this Wednesday, I believe, so we'll certainly get feedback from there. We'll share that with you, not to discourage anybody from what you just asked them to do, but we are continuing our conversation with the stakeholders. And I understand your concern about the industrial, and I will provide a little bit of information on that. I did myself go back and look at the prior plan. It does look like in the current plan, the consultant made an assumption that basically adjusted, probably lowered those fees more than they should have been by making some assumption about the amount of vacant industrial space that existed at the time. And so it substantially reduced the number of employees or the number of jobs that would be associated with industrial. We did, in one of the early stakeholder meetings, the industrial group did raise concerns, and we asked for and gave them the opportunity to provide any additional information that would help us do a better job of estimating employees per square foot in an industrial area, and we did not receive any information to help us make any additional adjustments, so we would welcome that information if it's available.
Do you have any All right, Councilmember Hampton.
Thank you also to staff and the stakeholders for providing input for this process. I know it's been a long one and a lot of good input, so thank you for that. And then, piggyback on other people's comments as well. I was also concerned with the non-residential as well. I just want to make sure that we're not going to slow down our economic growth in that aspect as well. So so we can get a good comparison and try to reach out to some of those industrial stakeholders as well. I'd also be some of the same concerns. So thank you for that. And then also, so just to clarify as well, so as growth goes up, you're saying that we could potentially, if growth goes a lot faster than we expect, up to 5% every year, we could raise it if needed, or we to redo it every 5 years, you said?
Councilmember, there is a provision where if we wanted to swap out like infrastructure, so if we already have streets in our arterial streets in our plan, if there was some need to add another segment of arterial street, we could add that without the process where we have to do all this publication and public hearings. It'd just be recalculated, post it for 60 days, and then have you act on that as long as it did not increase the fee by more than 5%. Okay. If for some reason growth either was much quicker than we had anticipated in this forecast or is slower than we have anticipated in this forecast, our best option would be go through another update process. And that was actually one of the reasons that we're a little bit ahead of the other cities, is we knew we didn't have inflation in our plan and growth was not occurring at the rate that we assumed. So we wanted to get to the point where we were addressing the plan more quickly to deal with those items.
Okay, yeah, because I'm hoping for the best case or scenario that all the developers do really well and we're growing really quickly, and development keeps coming, and so I just see what the outcome would be if that did happen. What down the road might look like. So, did you have a question? Some feedback?
I was just going to add, within 5 years, if the growth is faster, for most of the fees, it's not always precise, but it's proportionate to what the growth assumption is. So if growth is a little bit more higher than what we anticipate, at least in the short run, you're using the facilities a little bit faster. And so that's why I always try to make everything proportionate. So what I think the thing over time that will impact the fee, because you're having to build additional facilities that may cost more. But in the short run, what you'll do is you'll get more revenue to help fund those projects that we have. And it just, with anything that assumes debt or anything else, you'd be able to fund that debt a little bit better, or, just in the funding of those projects, it works out a little bit better. But you may get into the new projects, and some of the new projects are out in the latter part of the 10 years. Well, those projects, next time you look at it, are probably a little bit sooner than that. So it's designed to be proportionate. So if the growth is a little bit faster, you'd expect a little more revenue, but you'd be consuming those facilities a little bit more rapidly.
And then a question here. I had a question about the road. This might be off topic because I know it's not a very used bridge, but the Bullard Bridge, is that in this plan at all? I don't know how much growth is even expected that way, but I'm just curious about that bridge as well.
And are you referring to the Bullard Bridge that's south of Yuma?
Correct. Yeah, the one that goes across the river. It
is not included in this plan.
Okay. I don't know. There's not much growth there, but I'm just curious. So.
The other side of the Estrella Bridge, wasn't that on it? Vineyard to MC85, wasn't that? Didn't I see that in there?
The Estrella Bridge is on this.
Yeah. Second half.
The second half of it, correct.
Okay. Just making sure.
Yeah, I was just curious. I know we're talking about bridges, and I was thinking about other bridges that might be in the city. So I was just thinking about that one. It's a very small one, but still. And
all right.
I think that's about it, though. Yeah, thank you so much for working so hard for this, helping out with the residential and the industrial. So thank you.
All right, Councilwoman Laurentine. I'm sorry, Kano.
Thank you. As someone who's been on council about 10 weeks, this has been a very fascinating process. And It seems one of the operative words is assumptions, and you have to do the best you can with the experience and the projections going out. The advantage of coming in towards the end, some of my questions have been answered, and some of these may be foundational that others know, but I would like to know the timing of the Estrella Bridge. I see you're spreading it out over the 2 cycles, but if you could give me information on that.
Yes, absolutely, Councilmember. The study that was produced by Newland actually projects the need to be within the next few years. So we should expect that the design would probably start in 20, with construction possibly in 21 or 22. So quite soon.
Oh, good. That is soon, but I can see that it's definitely needed, and with the vineyard coming in there, it can be a little bit of a wild ride at time. I appreciate on streets the clarification that it does not include streets that are next to developable land, so that's helpful to understand how you come to that type of conclusion. I am curious about development north of I-10, how Liberty's anticipated infrastructures are met. Do they have a separate process?
I would assume through their rates. I don't know.
Through, a combination through their rates or upfront fees. But we don't particularly have, we don't have a comparison with Liberty. They're responsible for their infrastructure.
Right.
So.
However, they cover Goodyear, and that's cost of doing business as well.
And just to make sure it's clear, the Goodyear's portion of the water or wastewater fees would not apply in a Liberty service area.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I just want a little bit of clarification that if we were to lower some of the impact fees and then we would find that we lowered them too much, we would have to make up the difference. In fact, we would be responsible as a city, and it would come out of our general fund. Is that correct?
If I want to make sure I thoroughly answer the question, and if I don't get your answer, please ask me. Once you adopt this plan that calls for the infrastructure and the growth, if you adopt fees that are lower than what are determined in this plan, the city is obligated. It's not if the fees don't come in high enough, it is we are obligated to make up that difference. So if, for example, we said we're going to charge $100 less for fee Y, every time we collected fee Y, we would have to put $100 into that impact fee fund. So it isn't related to how much ultimately gets collected. It's related to setting the actual fees. Does that clarify what you were asking?
Yes, that was my understanding, but I just wanted to be sure we all understood that.
Okay.
I do have a concern as well with the industrial. However, I would hope that at the next stakeholder meeting, there will be those that will speak out to actually give us examples of how we may zero in a little more so it is not that high, because we do not want to do anything, we do not want to take any type of action that will stop or delay the development in Goodyear right now, because not everyone has run out and pulled their permits because they know we're going to raise fees, assuming all the cities probably will, and if they don't pull their permits, they're going to be subject to the new fees. And but I do want to thank you, Lori, and all of your staff, and Doug for reaching out so completely to the development community and to everyone involved in the impact fees. It's not every day that cities bend over backwards to hear everyone and to work with them. And we know this has been really time-consuming for you and your staff, but we do thank you for doing that, and thank you for all your presentations to us. And I think you have heard from us, unless we have any other. Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. Sherry does have another question.
I was just wondering, when you do bring back like the industrial and the retail and the office fees in a chart form, if we could also not just put in our local cities around us, but maybe those cities we might be competing against. I see Gilbert's here, but maybe include some of those other cities too. So we can kind of get a full picture of, you know, because we're competing against those and we don't want to be outside, like Vice Mayor Campbell said. We don't want to be so outside the ballpark that, you know, we're going to lose development. So if we could have not just those cities right next to us, but other cities we could be competing against for some of those complexes.
And are there any cities you all would prefer to see?
Mesa, Scottsdale, I'd say our normal benchmark cities.
Okay.
Just to give me an idea of what they are, because we don't see, those are such big projects, so we get an idea. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, are there any other questions?
And I just follow
yes.
up to, I would just
like
follow
to-
up to let you know that it's not only the budget staff that's working on this. There are members of every department that's represented here that are putting in their time and their effort to come to these meetings with the stakeholders and to listen and to do the research. And I bet there are a bunch of stakeholders sitting behind me that I see every time we have a meeting, and their involvement is greatly appreciated, and they put a lot of time and energy into being our partner.
Good. Well, we do thank all of the stakeholders that are here this evening. We thank all of the departments involved, because this has got to be a team effort. No one person can come up with all of these figures. But thank you all so very much for your help and your assistance. And Lori, are you done now? Is this it for you?
Not on the next one, so I'm out of here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so very much. All right. The last item is to receive a presentation regarding municipal debt from our finance director, Doug Sandstrom, will present. Hi, Doug.
Good evening. How are you?
Great. Thanks. How are you?
Good.
Good.
Now it's going to be one of the most exciting topics anybody has ever presented before you. Municipal debt is
We can hardly
something
wait.
everybody looks forward to. What we are going to go over tonight is all the items that you see up there on our agenda. What these items are is, and why we're here tonight, is to provide council with kind of a foundational understanding of what makes up the debt in the city, what makes our debt policies, what the implications are that for the CIP, and kind of just where we are today. Why this is coming up is we've had some discussions with council members who have talked about debt reduction and what does that mean. A lot of things when you talk about debt are similar to at home. You have to pay debt service, you have to plan, you have to do that. A lot of things are different though. So we just wanted to kind of go through, give everybody an idea of what it is that the situation that we're currently in with debt and what the underlying foundations of that is. Our municipal debt overall, the city has a debt policy. Each year that policy is brought before council as part of the budget process, and we go through and do a comprehensive overview with council and tell you where we are as far as meeting those requirements. The policy is based on GFOA best practices. It's adopted by council annually. We started that process 3 budget cycles ago. It establishes certain debt limits that are legal in nature, policy-wise, and then financial. Legal, it addresses things like the constitutional requirement of our capacity of 6% and 20% when it comes to general obligation bonds relating to our assessed valuation. Policy is the council policy of $1.74 for a total tax rate. So those are some of the policy considerations that are built into our overall debt policy. And then financial, some of them specifically call out at the discretion of the finance director, at the discretion of city management. And that becomes more of an operational type thing as we go through the process. But everything that is in our policy is very consistent with GFOA best practices, and we use this policy to guide debt decisions. In addition to guiding debt decisions, it also helps to guide with the development of the CIP and with what we present to council for infrastructure in the future. One of the things that a debt policy does, and is brought up every time we do a bond rating when we go out for bond issues, is it shows a commitment to long-term planning and debt payment. And that's something that outside agencies, Standards & Poor's, Moody's, they look at when they assign a rating. So having that debt policy adopted by council is something that is extremely important. lot of words on the next couple slides. I am not going to go through each and every one of these because these are our debt policies. And it's something that we go through during the budget process, and we give you the scorecard of how we are meeting those. Just quickly, the first one has to do with short-term debt. The city does not have any short-term debt. That's one of those that's left to the discretion of the finance director. It would be borrowing in the 3 to 7 year time range. We do not have any short-term debt nor have any plans to do so. Second one is also regarding short-term debt. The next is the Public Improvement Corporation, which has to do with mainly the ballpark and our coverage ratio. What coverage ratio means is, do you have the financial wherewithal to pay the debt? The coverage ratio, according to the policy, is 1.5 to 1. Ours is actually 6 times on the Public Improvement Corporation, so we're meeting that very well. One of the policies we'll see shortly, too, is that we should avoid using the general fund to pay for debt. The Public Improvement Corporation is the only general funded debt that we have. There's a small portion, mainly ballpark. There's a small portion that has to do with the GMC and the 911 center, but it is mainly ballpark. And that's a very important thing when we go through the debt, is what the funding source is. Because if you're talking about debt reduction or paying off debt, how it's paid for is extremely important as to where the savings would go to when we're doing that. Target tax rate of $1.74, we're all very familiar with. Annual levy collections at the maximum. That is something that factors in the $1.74. The primary property tax, which is used for operations, goes down each year as our assessed valuation increases, and that frees up capacity for issuing additional debt. Maintaining our bond rating is something that we strive to do. We're currently at an AA and an AA2, which is a very high quality rating. Enterprise funds should finance water and wastewater bond sales where appropriate. This is something that, as we go through the charts and graphs in a little bit, is very telling in the actions that staff has taken to meet this policy. A lot of our debt for water and wastewater is actually general obligation debt that was originally intended to be financed from secondary property taxes. Council said we want those to be funded by water, wastewater, so we have actually taken all that off the secondary property tax, put it onto the users so it is paid for out of rates. The only exception to that currently is about $7.5 million that was issued a couple years ago for the surface water treatment plant. And then the last one, again, bonds should not be financed from the general fund unless necessary, and that is one that we are very much aware of and in tune with. After our policies, the next thing that we look at is debt versus cash. Those are really the two decision points that you have to make when you go through the process of, you're going to be buying stuff, you're going to be planning for capital projects. Do we use debt? Do we use cash? Everything that you see up here, it is not good and bad. It's just pros and cons. There's a good and bad for both of these. Pros on debt is the timing. You get the project immediately. As soon as you have identified the need, you can go out, you can get it right now. Those who benefit, pay. If you go out today, borrow, build a park, and then start repaying that debt, the people who are repaying that debt, our residents, are actually getting the benefit of that park because the park is there. It provides for rate stability on the water wastewater side, so when we have large projects coming up, we can issue debt, do the project, spread it over many years as opposed to one big project in a year. Cons, of course, are financing costs. We'll see some of the costs of that with the interest rate and so on the next few slides that we go through. On the cash side, the pros, of course, is the total cost is going to be less. You do not have to pay interest on that. The opposite of that is it's going to take a while to accumulate those resources. The cost of building that project may be higher, and the benefit and payment are not aligned. You can have a family living in the city of Goodyear for 10 years who want a park, never have a park built because we're saving the money up for it. We then build a park, they sell their house, move out, a new family moves in, they get the benefit of the park having not paid a penny towards it. So that's what we mean when we talk about benefit and payment. Again, these are not right, wrongs. These are just pros and cons and the differences between them. They are all good, logical, rational choices between debt and cash. The types of debt, the 5 types of debt that we will be talking about tonight. are general obligation bonds. General obligation bonds are voter authorized bonds that are paid for using generally paid for using secondary property tax. Examples of what we have built using general obligation bonds are the current rec campus that is under construction under design, soon to be construction, will be funded through GO bonds. Fire Station 181, a lot of streets and water and wastewater infrastructure have been funded under general obligation bonds. Revenue bonds, also voter authorized. These have a specific revenue source tied to them. So we're using water and wastewater rates to pay off the debt associated with that, or we're using development impact fees to pay for it. Examples of this: water infrastructure, the water rights that we purchased a few years back, all are paid for utilizing water revenue bonds. The next one is excise taxes. Excise tax bonds are what has came before council under our Public Improvement Corporation. They are taxes where we are they're bonds that are not voter authorized. Council has the authorization to approve those, and we are using our state shared revenues and our sales tax to serve as the backstop to pay for those. So we are pledging those revenues to pay back that debt. Under the excise tax, the examples of what we've used are the ballpark, and again, the GMC and 911 Center are a couple of the smaller ones in there. Improvement district bonds are the McDowell Road Commercial Corridor. That's our only improvement district bond. That is used to pay for the infrastructure in there, and it gets reimbursed, or it gets paid for by assessments on the property owners in there. And then the final one is lease purchase. This is short-term debt. We do not have any short-term debt, do not have any lease purchase. Two items that are noticeably missing from this list are community facilities districts. CFDs, although the city has 10 of them, are a legally separate entity from the city of Goodyear, so I am not addressing those in this, and all the numbers that you see will not include community facility districts. And another one is pension. Our unfunded pension liability, from an accounting standpoint, from our comprehensive annual financial report, is considered a debt of the city, but it is not debt for the purposes of the discussion that we're talking about tonight, so I have left that off. The pension liability, CFDs, go back for 1 second, is $103 million of outstanding CFD debt currently. Our pension liability for police and fire is $27.6 million. That is a debt of the city. It's something that will factor in if we get to a point where we're talking about debt reduction, funneling excess one-time money towards something. That's where that'll come into the discussion. So if we have any further discussion about debt in the future, those are a couple of the things that will come into that discussion. The next few slides, what I'm going to do is walk through our existing debt. And again, this is existing debt. It does not include any of our planned debt. And as you know, our current CIP does have debt planned in it. And when we get to the CIP, we'll talk specifically about that. You can see here in the pie chart, we got it broken up by those categories that we just talked about. Our total outstanding principal by type is $279.1 million. Throughout this, I'm going to talk about principal as opposed to principal and interest, because a lot of these can be refinanced. You saw we just went through a whole slew of bondings where we've refinanced them, so the interest cost will change. If we were to take our current debt service on that $279 million and just pay it based on our current debt service schedules, we would pay $104.3 million worth of interest. Big, huge number on a big, huge number. So interest cost does definitely add up, but it's something you factor in when you're looking at using debt. The breakout that you see here is 38% is from the PIC, which is mainly the ballpark. Revenue bonds come in next at the 40.9, and then the general obligation actually is $97 million of that 35%. I had mentioned earlier how when we look at debt reduction as well as issuing debt, the important thing is where does the money come from to pay for it. So we're going to go to the next slide and show where the money comes from using these same categories. You'll notice when we switch, the excise and the improvement district don't change because that is set the way those are coming in. It's the revenue bond and general obligation that changes, and that is because of that council direction we had before of making sure that water and wastewater paid for itself. So you can see the difference here where the revenue bonds, water and wastewater is 15%, but when you go to how it's actually paid for, it comes to about 34% on paying for those two items from our rates. Secondary property tax is at 16%. That is what the secondary portion of that $1.74 tax rate covers. The secondary portion is about 63 cents goes to pay for our general obligation debt. And again, that reminder and the very important thing when we talk about reduction is how it's paid for is where the money would go back if we did do any savings in these different areas. So now moving on from what our total outstanding debt is, we're going to go into debt service. So what does this look like on an annual basis? You can see here for the current fiscal year 2019, debt service payments for the city total about $30 million. For the next couple of years, they are up there at that $30 million. Then they go down and they level off at about $25 million for the next 10 years or so. That is something that is a planned approach to debt. When we go through and issue our debt, we actually structure what our debt payments are according to what other existing debt is and when debt is paid off so that we can keep that debt service relatively consistent all the way through and we do not see any huge fluctuations. When we went through the refinancing of the ballpark, which is shown here in the gray is the ballpark debt, you can see that's fairly consistent all the way across. The debt schedule that we had refinanced, that had debt service payments that fluctuated from a low of $8.5 million up to $14.5 million. So it really fluctuated year to year, which has impacts on our operations. Having nice, smooth, consistent debt service helps us plan out our operation and minimize the impact on operations. The debt service schedules that you see right here are, again, current debt without any planned debt put in there. And as we know, our current CIP does have some planned debt in there. Moving on to the concept of debt reduction in that existing debt, how that debt is paid determines where the savings will go. That's something when we walk through all these slides, you're going to consistently hear that again and again. And then is there the ability to pay off debt? The two terms in municipal debt are callable and non-callable. Callable means we have the ability to pay it off. Non-callable means we cannot pay it off without paying 100% of the interest assigned to it, basically a prepayment penalty. Under municipal debt, it's very common to have non-callable for the first 10 years of a 20-year cycle. So it's to make sure that the people that are buying the bonds can count on that interest for a set amount of time. When we go through and did our refinancing, we had a whole bunch of debt that came to that 10-year period, and we refinanced all of that as soon as it became callable. So callable and non-callable factors into that. You have to have the ability to pay off the debt in order to pay off the debt. And that's the other thing that you will see in the coming up slides is the impact of those refinancings. Because we refinanced, we did not extend the length of the debt. However, we did get into a new phase of uncallable 10-year period on the debt that we refinanced. So when we go through our outstanding general obligation debt with call options, so if we wanted to pay off general obligation debt, the orange is non-callable. So in the current fiscal year, we do not have any GO debt that is callable. Small portions become callable in the next few years, with it really starting to become significantly callable about 8 years from now in fiscal year 2027. If we were to pay off general obligation debt, that would have a direct link to our tax rate. The tax rate would go down. You cannot keep your tax rate high and over-collect to pay off debt. You can set your tax rate only at the amount to pay the actual debt service assigned to it. So we would not be able to pay it off, keep the debt rate constant, try to accelerate payments of it. It has to be only for that 1 year's debt service. Also included in this dollar amounts here are the water and wastewater portions that are paid for that were originally issued as debt service. So on those, if we were to pay those off, that would have a direct impact on our operations within water and wastewater. This again is our current outstanding debt. We do have plans for future debt in the CIP in the general obligation area with the rec campus, police ops, streets, fire, and so on. That would add to the outstanding debt in here when those were issued. Water and sewer, you can see this is an area where just a few years from now, there is a large portion of this that would become callable and would be open for potential reduction of debt if that is what we were looking to do. Large callable amounts. This is paid for 100% from water and wastewater revenue. So any savings on the debt side go right back into those water and wastewater funds, would have impacts on future rates and as well as on operations. Again, this is current debt. One of the largest areas of debt that we will be looking at in the near future is associated with the surface water treatment plant, which will be coming right out of the water fund in here and impact this chart right here. That callability a couple of years from now is something that would come into play on how we structure the debt for the new surface water treatment plant to, again, try to levelize that debt service as we move forward. And then the last area that we will talk about on the different prints on the callable and not callable is the PIC. This is the portion that is paid for from the general fund. This is almost, I'd say about 99% is associated with the ballpark. Because we did just refinance it, you start to see that the callability starts to come in about 2023. Any reduction in debt service in this area substantially would start in 2023 if we were to do it, and that would have a direct impact on the general fund and on general fund operations. That callable feature on here does not have anything to do with when we would start receiving money from the Arizona Sports and Tourism Authority. Because we have been funding that 100% from the general fund, when and if we start receiving money from the Sports and Tourism Authority, that is a unrestricted general fund revenue that we can use to pay for ballpark debt, to pay ourselves back for it, to pay off ballpark debt. It's going to be up to the discretion of council to use those funds when they do start to come in. That is estimated to start coming in 2021, actually 2 years prior to these becoming callable. Two areas that we did are, when we went through here, I did not go through the callability on the McDowell Road Improvement District. Because it's an improvement district tied to assessment bonds, that is 100% callable at any time. It's tied to the property owners in there, so when a property owner wants to pay it off, they're able to pay it off. One of the things that you will see on our next council meeting is a reapportionment of part of the McDowell Road Improvement District, forming a couple new lots. Macerich, one of the major property owners in there, recently sold an area, and they're actually going to be paying off several of their assessments when they do this reapportionment and some different things. And that's 100% on the landowner to decide whether they're going to do that or not. So it is 100% callable. The next area that I'm going to go into then is the CIP. Debt has a lot to do with our CIP. What we just went through is what our current debt structure is and our current debt. Our 5-year forecast in our CIP for fiscal year 19 through 23 is $330 million. 33% of that $330 million is funded by new debt that we have not just talked about. So $111 million of that 330 is for new planned debt over the next couple of years. The projects that we're planning debt on that is included in that CIP are listed up there. The big ones on the GO side are the police operations, the rec center, aquatic center, and the fire station. And then on the revenue side, a very big chunk has to do with that surface water treatment plant, as well as some ongoing well infrastructure. And the thing to keep in mind on this one is the CIP for fiscal year 19 through 23 was a limited CIP. So we only included items in there that we absolutely knew the cost of. Those and everything else was kind of put into a holding pattern of a project reserve. So when we come in and start looking at these again, there are going to be increased costs associated with the rec center, some of the fire stations and so on. Those are things that are not factored into that $330 million. And one of the main ways you would pay for those is through debt. When we look at our CIP, the $330 million and how that $333 million is paid, 33%, as I said, is debt. You can see up here with the water and wastewater bonds, new GO bonds, as well as the GO bonds that we recently issued a year and a half ago. That's something we'll talk about in a second, is why we issue GO bonds in smaller increments, and that has to do with the target tax rate. Also on here, you'll see the impact fees is 43%. Included in that is the developer contribution that we will be getting from Newland associated with the surface water treatment plant. They're going to be fronting that money and then repaid from development impact fees in the future from in there as well, and that's how we're funding the surface water treatment plant. Only 9% comes from the general fund, and that 9% is construction sales tax and fund balance or savings from the previous year. So that is 100% at the discretion of council on how those funds are spent. And then also 7% comes from water rates, from the operations of the water and rates. So a very small proportion comes from unrestricted funds or from other than debt. I had mentioned on the GO bond, on the new debt, and when we issue new debt, that all has to do with council policy on the city's target tax rate of $1.74. That $1.74 is the combined property primary and secondary property tax rate, with the primary being about $1.10 and the secondary rate being 64 cents. The secondary rate is what is used to pay for the debt service, and it's set to pay for exactly what that debt service is. The CIP, as currently adopted for 19 through 23, includes $12 million of GO debt to be issued next fiscal year. The target tax rate through fiscal year 24 will support an additional $53 million of debt. So our target tax rate of $1.74 will support $65 million of new general obligation debt of items, some that are included in the CIP, some that are not included in the CIP. So we can issue $65 million of debt in 3 separate increments to maintain that tax rate. And that's one of the things with that $1.74 tax rate and how we issue debt is we do smaller issues in order to maintain tax rate stability. We don't want to have a tax rate that drops one year, spikes up the next year, drops another year, and then spikes up again. So we're trying to maintain the tax rate at a nice, consistent $1.74. Each year when the assessed valuation of the city increases, that's what gives us the capacity to issue additional debt. The graph you see right here shows our forecast through fiscal year 2024, with the blue area being what we believe the primary tax rate will be, the red area being what our secondary rate will be for existing general obligation debt, with this light gray area, that capacity to issue additional debt. What we would be looking forward for in our under our current practice and policies is issuing about $30 million worth of GO debt this next fiscal year. 2 years later, an additional $21 million, and then in 2024, $14 million. That would be the total of that $65 million. And that's after we go through the CIP process and actually identify projects that are going to be in there, and assuming that there will be projects that will meet that $65 million need. In summary, the council adopted policies, as you saw as we were going through here. That's what guides our debt issuance, and it directly impacts the CIP, how we as management go through and look at the CIP, put it together, and bring it forward to council with our recommendation is based on those policies. Because of the refinancing that we've recently done, there is a lot of our debt that's non-callable in the next few years. So if to look at pure debt reduction, really until 2022, 2023, there's no real opportunities for that. Debt plays a major role in our CIP. 33% of our currently planned CIP is debt. If we were to go down a path of no new debt, that would mean 33% of our CIP would not have any funding. If we were to say no new debt and we want to reduce debt, that would then take funds from the general fund, that very limited amount that we have that we would be doing projects with, would then be going to reduce debt as well. So it would have a very significant impact on our CIP. if we were to do that, because debt has played such a historically such a role in implementing our CIPs. Further discussion on debt and debt reduction will either happen at the retreat if desired by council, or it will definitely happen as we go through the budget and CIP process and make those presentations to council. And again, the area that I did not cover up here that would play into any discussion on debt reduction would be our public safety pension unfunded liabilities, and that's something that will play into our budget discussions as well. And with that, I'll open it up for any questions, comments.
All right, questions? I'm going to start with Councilmember Stipp first, and then I'll get you, Joe.
Just an observation on this particular thing. We probably should have stopped about 5 slides in each time for questions, because I'm going to take you all the way back to the beginning. You mentioned very early on, Doug, and some of this is not necessarily questions as much as it might be for someone listening or trying to pay attention to what we're trying to accomplish here. One of the things you talked about was maxing our levy. Mm-hmm. And there's a real reason why we do that besides the revenue. Can you talk about that a little bit? Why do we max the levy?
Maximize our primary property tax levy?
Yes.
Back in about 2006, the state legislature made a change in state law that recapped what a city can do when it comes to primary property tax levies. They capped it at what you currently were at that time for assessed valuation. And then your assessed valuation, regardless of what the market was and what actual home values were, you are limited to a 5% increase in your property, in your assessed valuation, plus new growth. So there's artificial limitations put in on how fast our property tax levy our property tax assessed valuation can grow, which has a direct impact on our levy.
So if we didn't max out the levy every single year, but we came up short to that levy, that is a multiplier.
Correct.
Over the years. So I think we want to really talk, when we talk about debt and levy, I think it's important for everybody to understand that if we short that up, that shortage just multiplies as the years go on.
Correct.
Okay, so the second point, I guess, you talked about pension liability, and you mentioned that it's not the same debt like a GO bond debt, that accounting rules require us to show it on the books as a debt. Is there at any point, would we have to write a check for $27 million at one time?
Not at one time, no. We will, one of the things that we will be bringing back to council by the end of this fiscal year, there's a new state statute that requires us to have a policy on our public safety pension liability and how we're going to go about addressing that. And that policy will address what we're going to do. But how that would work is we are currently paying in through our annual contribution rates. There's a portion that goes towards that unfunded liability. And that's how we plan to continue paying for that, is through our annual apportionment of the public safety tax. We take other measures of paying the entire annual amount up front to capture some of the interest costs. So we're doing some small things to reduce that, but at no time will there ever be somebody that knocks on the door and says, you owe us $27 million for this. It is a long-term liability. We've committed to everybody who is in those pension funds that they're going to get a pension, and that's what those funds are.
And it's been calculated through, so the horror stories that we hear from Illinois and California about public pension debt crushing cities, they're under a completely different financial and calculation situation than we are here.
Correct. Not only when you look at other states, but also within the state of Arizona, every single police and fire entity is city by city is a separate pension fund. So how the city of Goodyear is impacted by the pension is completely different than how the city of El Mirage or the city of Casa Grande or any other city would be impacted by it. And those impacts are We have 20-year actuarial reports that are calculated, and that long-term liability is factored into those and into the rates that we pay.
Okay, so so I appreciate that explanation. I think it's really important for public and everybody to understand that when they hear about California, Illinois, public pension debt, it's not even it's not even apples and oranges. It's
correct.
Peas and apples. Okay. Guac. Yeah, peas and guac for those of you that saw it. All right, last question-ish. You talked about debt service payments, and the majority of our debt service, with the exception of that part from the Public Improvement Corporation, i.e. the ballpark, is all paid with secondary property tax.
Correct.
So even if we were to, quote unquote, win the lottery and want to pay off some of that debt, there's no direct benefit to the general fund by doing that, correct?
Correct.
The exception of the ballpark.
With the exception of the ballpark, the only one that would have a direct benefit to the general fund would be the paying off of the PIC, the ballpark. Otherwise, it would be a reduction in the property tax rate, or it would be a bonus into the water and wastewater operations.
Okay. And I think when we talk about government debt, folks hear a $20 trillion national debt and they lose their minds, and then they hear Goodyear's got a $333 million debt. Oh my God, how could you do that? It's not the same. And I think that when we have these discussions about public debt, really getting that framed in the right light helps all of us, and especially helps us communicate that to the public when we see them about what does our debt, how is our debt different than the debt of the federal government versus the debt that you have at home. And I think sometimes none of us could save up enough money in the amount of time to purchase our home with cash the same way we do. That's the same principle that we do all of our government projects. We'd be living in a small apartment for our entire lifetime before we saved enough to buy a house. We would be living with very little. We'd still have a volunteer fire department. We'd still have 2 cops on the street if we didn't do go forward with some of this debt. So I think the conversation is very good, and it's for anybody who's paying attention to it to really try to understand the differences. So I appreciate the information tonight. Thanks.
Thank you.
Councilmember Priscilla.
First, I want to thank you. You did a very thorough job of walking it through and explaining it. A couple things to follow up on what Councilmember Stipp was mentioning about the police. We're not like Chicago, I agree, but unfortunately there were some cities, I think, I don't know if it was south of us or whatever, where hiring a police officer, their percentage they had to kick in was almost as much as the police officer.
Correct. The highest I've heard is 102%. Yeah.
So some of them didn't get off as easy. What are we paying right now?
We're paying 27% for fire and 30% for police.
And that'll probably be for 20 years, did you say?
20 years, correct. Okay. Yeah, and
so
about 10% of that is due to the unfunded liability. Correct. 15% is just the normal rate.
It's a lot better than 102.
Correct.
All right. So we're not in bad shape, but some of them, unfortunately, and I think it had to do with the age of the people in the public safety on both sides, is depending on what your makeup was, is what drove that huge number. Correct. On some of them. Okay. All right. But Goodyear is not in that shape. All right. So to piggyback on what you're talking about, we're not in that shape. But I agree, as you go through there, if you're going to pay off debt, the one thing that, to me, and we don't have any choice right now with the ballpark, but I'm not a big fan of using general fund operating revenue for debt service. Just never have been. Why? Because that's like using your day-to-day operations you need for paying the police, the roads, the street, or whatever, and you're borrowing money. Almost like the federal government, when they talk about that $1 trillion debt, they've got such a large percentage of the money that comes in. They have very little discretionary funds to buy anything else because they've dug themselves such a hole. Our debt service typically has a revenue source associated with it, whether it's the fees for the water, whether it's the property tax for the GO. But when you come to general fund, that's coming right out. It's almost, in my view, almost like the federal government where you're taking a percentage of your operating to cover your debt service. Ours is low. It's about 10%, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
But still, I would prefer, which we can't, to have it as lower than that. But I understand. To me, if we were going to look to pay any debt when it comes time to callable, that to me has the greatest direct impact, other than the public safety one, where you can reduce that down a little bit on our general fund to free up funds for doing other things. Bond committee. Are we going to have to put one together in the near future for authorization, or do we have enough capacity there?
For the plans that we know of today, we have enough capacity, and for the things that we're talking about, we'll have a better idea of that after we go through the CIP process, and if anything pops up that isn't on anybody's radar right now.
Because I know we had used a few, and I wasn't quite sure with the 6 or 20% how much of that we actually had going forward on there. But again, I appreciate the presentation. Like I said, capital, when you're using GO, you have property tax to cover it. Water, sewer rates, with the one exception, which, I have a problem with, but the one exception is being covered by the water and sewer rates. So, again, great presentation, thorough presentation of how this stuff and how it works. And my only question is, if we're going to put it anywhere, to me, it's getting the general fund operating revenue freed up with some more money. Speaking of which, have we heard anything from the Tourist and Sports Authority as far as any potential money in 2021? Have we heard anything from them yet?
We get an update annually, and the last update was in May of this year. And it's going to be about 2021, where we'll start seeing about $1.8 million.
Okay. That's a drop in a bucket what we're paying, but I guess every little bit helps, yes.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. I don't know.
Councilmember Hampton.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, it was a very good presentation. I appreciate it. And I said a couple quick questions. So, yeah, to Joe's point, freeing up the general fund would be nice in the future as well. And then I know our rating, one of the things that's tied to our ratings is the pension liabilities, what they look at as well. So I know that'd be nice to reduce. It might help us with interest rates going forward. But talking about interest rates, since we just recently redid them, and our interest rates are fairly low right now in general. Correct. In 10 years, they're not going to be a huge drop per se. Maybe slightly. Is that correct?
I just met with one of our financial advisors lately, and whereas he showed me a chart from 1961 until today, and today's rate is lower than 87% of the rate than all of recorded back to 1961. In the early 80s, rates were actually like 14% on general obligation bonds. They have been under 5% for the last 10 years or so. They're going up right now. How high they're going to go up, I don't know. They keep going up, and eventually they come down. So. And it's definitely something that we're looking at now. I was talking to him saying, to me, this feels like a high interest rate environment compared to what we've been used to the last 2 years. And he's like, you haven't seen nothing. So I'm hoping that it stays in that manageable area.
Yeah, and they're all callable bonds. There's nothing like a put. The bondholder can't bring it back.
Correct. Yeah, all the debt that we currently have out there has set interest rates and will not change unless we go and actively do something to refund them.
Okay. And then is there a sinking fund in here too for that debt?
With the sinking fund, you mean our asset replacement?
Yeah, how we do I know when you go out there, you're supposed to have enough money to repay it if you need to, if called upon. Is there a
The only thing I'm thinking is with our asset management, we're setting aside for those large capital purchases like our fire truck replacements, things like that. That is not included in anything on here or on the where we were doing the set aside to prepare for the ballpark debt that was increasing.
That was the sinking fund.
That was
that
was the same.
Okay. That is not factored into this at all, but the ballpark now is leveled out, so that would be outside of our set aside fund. And then we're still looking at that for the operations of different capital projects.
Okay. And then It's at the, yes, we don't have very much, we don't have very much revenue funds. It's really just the water and things that we can charge.
Correct.
In the future. And then, let me see. Okay. Yeah, I'm glad we don't have any short-term debt right now either, so that's good. But, okay. And then we don't have any industrial, I think I emailed you about it as well. No one, was it industrial development bonds?
The Industrial Development Authority that the city has, the last of the bonds that were issued by the Industrial Development Authority were paid off in 2015. They were from Litchfield Utilities, Liberty Utilities, excuse me. They paid those off in 2015, and with some changes at the state level, with the state IDA now in place, and there's an office where you go to the state, and they have an IDA and other funding sources. The use of our IDA in the near term is not something that most people would be looking at. They would go to the state to be able to consolidate it with some other financing that they have.
Okay. So you're saying that wouldn't be a good option if we wanted to do some public, some kind of bond?
Correct.
Thing.
I've gotten a couple companies that have called regarding use of our IDA, and I direct them right to the Arizona Department of Commerce, because the Arizona Department of Commerce has the same IDA function, and then they're able to partner it up with other grants and other financing to make it way more lucrative than something we as just an IDA would be able to do.
And then when we redid the ballpark that recently, that was not a IDA, that was part of the excise?
That was part of the excise tax, so the Public Improvement Corporation backed by our excise taxes.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, Councilwoman Larantano.
Thank you, Doug. That was a great presentation, a lot of information. I think that's something that, it's always nice because I don't think all the citizens know necessarily how all the debt works in the city, and sometimes hearing numbers can be misleading. I know Joe made me a devotee to the levy rather than the rate in the last several years. My question was really following up with regard to the ballpark. Obviously, I was going to ask when we get it. It sounds like we're going to get 1.8 million, but I guess 2021 is not that far away. Is that going to be a steady amount, or is that something we're looking to grow, or do we not even know yet at this part?
Based on current projections, it starts at 1.8 in 2021, and then in 2024, when some Maricopa Stadium debt gets retired, we get a portion diverted to us, and it jumps up to about 4.6 million, and then it stays steady at about that 4.6 million, and that's based on projections that we have today.
Okay, so that's still not guaranteed until we start seeing a check. And then that's money we can use for any purpose.
Correct, because we've been using general fund dollars to pay for it. Those will be unrestricted general fund dollars when they come in.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Councilwoman Larantano.
The McDowell Road Improvement District, could you just give me a brief overview of that? Does that have to do with the regional center and the off-ramps and things like that, just to help me get a picture?
Correct. It has to do with what's known as the mall site, and it is
for
all all the infrastructure that's in place in there, the roadway network, the lines under the ground, and so on. So it's all of the infrastructure put in there. Everybody who owns property in there has an assessment associated that's tied to their property, and then they pay twice annual assessment payments to the city to pay that debt service.
Okay. And that municipal debt overview that's up there now, that is how we pay our debt, the sources?
Correct. That is the sources of where the money comes from to actually pay the debt.
Okay. And then just to clarify, because I'm looking at slides on page 16, and that's how we pay our CIP.
Is that this one?
Yes.
Yes, that's the funding for our CIP.
Okay, very good. Thank you for the presentation. Extremely helpful for me.
Thank you.
All right, and I just have a question. We still do not have our CIP ready.
Correct.
To go just exactly yet. So we can only issue $65 million in debt. And you said that the CIP has part of that debt, right?
Correct. currently, the current CIP for fiscal year 19 through 23
Is 111.
has $12 million of general obligation debt tied to it. Over the next 5 years, we will have the capacity to issue $65 million. So there's about $53 million of capacity of general obligation debt that is not currently identified in the CIP.
Okay, and that's just for the CIP, but we don't know what projects we're going to fund yet because that
Correct.
decision has not been made.
Correct. We're just starting the CIP project process to add that next year in and really start to look at that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Are there any other questions, Council? Wonderful presentation, Doug. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
There being no further business to discuss, the meeting is now adjourned. But do not leave, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to move right on into the next meeting. Thank you. I'd like to call to order the special meeting for September